Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. So on today's video, we are going to take a look at the Chinese housing market, and more specifically, we are going to study the current crisis that is going on with the company called as Evergrande, and more importantly, how it is going to impact the world economy and the world stock markets. Very important video, stay till the very end. I'm going to shoot this video in a slightly unedited format because I'm shooting it today and I'll try to release it today itself. And I'll speak in 5 simple points. Please stay tuned, you will learn a lot. Also, people from Probo reached out to me. They said that, hey, you're teaching macroeconomics, so why don't you create a question for us? So I've created a question on macroeconomics related concept regarding Evergrande on Probo platform. You can check it out. I myself have put a trade on Probo, which I'm going to show you during this video. So you can check out different perspectives, understand my perspective from the video, and accordingly navigate the situation. So, 5 points that I'm going to speak about. 1, I'm going to speak about the Chinese housing market and what Evergrande does and how big a company it is. Second, we are going to cover that what is the crisis about, why is there so much hoopla going on in China regarding this crisis. Then we are going to talk about the likely intervention that the Chinese government is going to undertake. Fourth, we are going to take a look at what would be the impact of this crisis on the global stocks, especially India, especially the commodity sector in India, because a lot of you have been messaging me, sir, have you sold SAIL? Sir, have you sold JSW Steel? All that stuff. So I'm going to answer all those questions. Fifth and finally, I'm going to give you my verdict on what is going to happen. That is my viewpoint. I might be completely off, but that is my viewpoint. Please listen to it carefully and form your own opinions. So let's get started, and let's start by understanding the Chinese housing market first. I'll give you a very quick crash course here. So up until 2008, the Chinese housing market was doing really well. In fact, Chinese housing market makes up 20% of GDP of China. So it is fairly big, fairly obvious, contributes a lot to the Chinese economy. So fairly important sector for China. Up until 2008, doing really well. 2008, crisis hit, a lot of bad things happened in the world. And the Chinese housing market also took a slump and a hit with the entire world. So when the 2008 crisis ended, the housing market in China started climbing back up and it started exhibiting growth, and things were looking hunky-dory till 2016. Everything was going really well and a lot of good things were happening. The Chinese market was booming, the economy was flying, all that good stuff. But the growth was still slowing down and the Chinese government intervened and it sort of instituted policies that pushed buyers to buy more and more homes, right, since 2016 to the present day. So that is the overview of the housing sector in China has been. So I hope you got the context. Now where does Evergrande comes in? So Evergrande is one of the top 2 real estate developer in China, and it is a fairly big company. So it has been developing a lot of properties. They are also not only exclusively developing properties, they are also owning like sports league. They are developing like a football stadium. They are investing in different companies that manufacture cars. So this is a big conglomerate. Yes, their primary focus has been on real estate development. That is what they primarily do. But they are also quite active in other businesses. So it's a conglomerate mostly focused on real estate. So I hope we are clear about 2 things. One is that we are clear about the housing market in China. And second is that what is it that Evergrande does. So let's move on to the second point. The second point is that, okay, what is the origin of the crisis and what is actually happening? So here is where the story starts, that Evergrande has not been reporting losses for the last several years. It is China, they hide data, companies also hide data. So bad things were happening in the company. Management was not very responsible. They were taking on more and more debt and they were not reporting any losses. So the banks that have given Evergrande debts, so how do you get a debt? So basically, if Evergrande wants to take on, let's say, $500 billion of loan, they will go to a bank or they will issue corporate debt and they will take money via those instruments. So this is how Evergrande would have raised money and would have taken on more money. And because of poor financial practices and no auditing, or rather no good and authentic auditing happening with the company, this company was running businesses poorly. The businesses were not making money. For example, the car business in which Evergrande had invested, it did not sell many cars and it was a completely loss-making business. But all these losses were not being reported. So as a result, the company could not repay back its loan. And when the time came to repay the loans, they said that, you know what, banks, we can't pay it. Do whatever you want to do. So that is called as defaulting on the loan. So Evergrande is going to default on its loan. That is what the news has been. And seeing this, the erosion of the company has been massive and the company has lost almost 80% of its share price over time. So this is the origination of the crisis, that this company, lot of bad businesses being done, accounting has been really poor, very high debt company. They have taken on debts in excess of $300 billion. So huge debt, and they are unable to repay this debt. Now you would say that, Akshat, I have heard of this story somewhere. Can you remind me where this story comes from? Okay. So this is how even 2008 financial crisis also somewhat originated. So in 2008, big banks in the US, they gave out a lot of subprime loans, right? They essentially lended out money to people who had no capacity to repay the loans. They said that, hey, here are like $100,000 on loan to you, go buy a home. And why did the US banks did that? Because they felt that, hey, housing prices will always keep on going up. So eventually people will repay us. That's the simplified story. Of course, it's more complicated than that. But that is where the origination of subprime crisis happened, that these banks, commercial banks, investment banks, they worked in assets which gave out subprime loans to people who invested their money in real estate, and the real estate bubble burst because no one was able to repay the loans. Even people who were unemployed got loans to buy the house. Of course, they were not able to repay their EMI, and the prices of housing came down crashing. So the current crisis that you're seeing with the Chinese government and Evergrande, that similar sort of crisis had played out in 2008. This is a very important point for you to note, because this is a very important point regarding the conclusion of this video, which I'll explain going forward. So let's move on to point 3. I hope you understood the housing market. You understood what Evergrande does. You understood the origination of the crisis, what is the crisis and hoopla about. So let's talk briefly about what is it that Chinese government can do regarding this particular crisis. Now, the Chinese government can do exactly what the US government did back in 2008 when the financial crisis in the US hit. So the banks in the US had total debt or unpaid debt of approximately $700 billion. That was the bailout package from the US government. Here, in the current contemporary crisis in China, we are talking about a $300 billion debt. Okay, half of it or less than half of it. So, number one, the Chinese government can handle this crisis exactly the way the US government had handled the crisis back in 2008. This goes back to the concept of Keynesian economics, that the government has the power of printing money, giving it to people, bailing them out, this, that, right? So, lot of stuff governments can do. Now, you would say, Akshat, okay, why is it that the government will bail out these real estate companies? Because this is not a bank, right? Bank, I understand that if a bank goes down, then probably they are interconnected to other banks. For example, if HDFC Bank goes down, then probably ICICI Bank will also go down, because these banks lend money to each other, right? Because there is always something called as interlending. So ICICI Bank will lend a lot of money to HDFC, HDFC will lend a lot of money to Yes Bank, Yes Bank will lend a lot of money to SBI, all that, right? So bottom line is that all these banks are interconnected. So if one major bank, systematically important bank, so in India we have a concept of systematically important banks. If one systematically important bank fails, the repercussions or the collateral damage will be on almost all these systematically important banks, and the entire banking system will collapse. But you would say that, okay, hey, here we are talking about a real estate company. If it goes under, what's the big deal? Why does the Chinese government need to intervene and save this company? The reason again is quite similar, because the $300 debt or $300 billion debt that Evergrande has taken, they have taken from various multiple banks, including Chinese banks and including other investors which are from outside China also. So if one major Chinese bank goes under because it is not able to service all that or take a hit on all that $300 billion of debt, other Chinese banks might also fall. And that is the point of origination of this crisis. And to avoid this, back in 2008, the US government intervened and gave a bailout package to these US-based banks. So I hope this point is clear, that despite the gravity of the situation in China right now, it's not as if that the Chinese government will just put their hand on hand and would not do anything. They will have to come in, they will have to intervene, and they will have to handle the situation. Why? Because it can be detrimental to the Xi Jinping's, who is the president of China, his regime. Okay, so I am on the Probo app. I will go on the finance category question. So I will look for the question that I had created. If I scroll it down, this is the question that I had written. Will the Chinese government bail out Evergrande by the end of November 2021? So my bet is, or my understanding is that they would. They have no other option but to. The time period is a little bit iffy. We don't know whether this will get done by November of 2021. So that's a slightly risky proposition from my end. So I will read all the additional information that has been given and whatever I have shared through the video, and I will place a trade on yes. So I'm going to place a trade for. So if it happens that Xi Jinping is not able to handle the economic affairs of this company and protect the banking sector in China, of course people will come after him. They will call him a powerless leader. So he has to step in. It's more of a political game rather than an economic game in China. So I hope this point is clear. Now you would say, okay, you know what, Akshat, this sounds like really weird. Why is it that the Chinese government is waiting up until now? Why can't they just directly go and save it? They could have. But of course, there are like political repercussions. Now, I don't know the inside story. But bottom line is that no government wants to be seen in cahoots or in partnership with all these private players, so to say, right? It's not as if the Indian government can lend a lot of money directly to Reliance or save them. If they do such a thing, then there might be a lot of questions asked. So, the same might be the situation in China, that they cannot work with Evergrande directly, but they might help Evergrande indirectly. So, how? How exactly? So, for example, right now, Evergrande owes $300 billion of money to, let's say, Chinese banks. And Chinese banks are hoping that, hey, Evergrande will pay them back. Now, what the Chinese government can do is that it can ask its state-owned bank in China to say that, you know what, waive off this debt that you have given to Evergrande and rather take equity in Evergrande's corporation. So, rather than owning debt, so banks own what? Banks own debt in Evergrande. Rather than owning debt, they might have equal value of equity or even more equity. That's one of the possible options that the Chinese government from behind the curtains can facilitate. This takes time, this takes a lot of effort, this takes a lot of political maneuvering, and the Chinese government might already be on it. This is a very important point that you need to keep in mind. Now you would say that, okay, hey, you know what, understand all this economic analysis and all that stuff, but why is it such a big deal, right? If some company or some private company fails, let it be, right? I mean, fine, we went through that 2008 financial crisis also, world survived. Now, it's not as if that this is just purely an economic crisis and has to do only with Evergrande. What will happen is that if this Evergrande company fails completely, then they are currently employing 200,000 people or Chinese workers. That's a huge number, right? And it will lead to a lot of hue and cry. It is already happening in China. So the Chinese government has to intervene at some stage. That is what the assumption is by many commentators that understand the China story. So to cut the long story short, I too feel that the Chinese government will intervene sooner rather than later and will try to handle this situation. And there is already a roadmap as to how to handle this crisis, because in 2008, an entire roadmap has been developed by the US Feds. They have already done this kind of a bailout. So the China just has to copy this model and replicate it in current economic scenario. If they don't do it, then it's somewhat of a political suicide. It might happen that they do not intervene, right? That is a likelihood scenario also. But the chances of that happening is lower. So with that said, let's move on to the next point and we will briefly discuss how this current crisis is going to impact the world economy going forward. So now there are two scenarios that can play out. One is that, hey, if the Chinese government intervenes and if this situation is handled, then of course there will be little bit of short-term pain. It is reflecting already in the Indian market and other world markets as well. Little bit of short-term pain, little bit of correction, then things will go back to normal. Now, if the Chinese government does not intervene and Evergrande fails, and as a result, multiple other banks fail, because of which other international institutions also fail, then this crisis can escalate. It might not lead to a bear run, but it might lead to a correction. So this is how it's going to play out, that if the Chinese government intervenes, then the situation will be handled. If the Chinese government does not intervene, then the likely scenario is that the world will go, or world might go through a bit of pain. Alright, now you would be scared. Now you would say that, hey Akshat, what should I do with my stocks? I'm currently sitting with a lot of commodity-based stocks also. So see guys, I'm not selling my stocks in sale and bunch of other commodity stocks that I have purchased. I feel that this situation will be resolved. There might be a little bit of short-term pain, but I'm not selling my stocks. I'm completely okay taking some notional hit in the meantime. I'm sure that like me, you would not have invested all your money in steel stocks, right? So I'm assuming that you would have only invested 3 to 5% or max 10% in this sector. So if you have done that, then there is nothing to be worried about. Just sit tight and relax. This situation will be resolved at some stage. That is what I am feeling. Second thing, what might happen in the market right now is a lot of FIIs and domestic institutional investors, they will rotate their capital from one sector to the next. If they feel that, you know what, the metal sector is somewhat overvalued, they might move to some other sector. This is called a simple sector rotation. Nothing to be worried about. Whenever good opportunity presents, exit this stock. There is no need to exit these stocks as of now. Now comes the most important fifth and final point from my side, that regarding this entire crisis, you need to understand a fundamental concept about the stock market. The stock market hates uncertainties, and that is when the major correction happens if there is a very uncertain event. When the 2008 financial crisis happened, the entire stock market took a deep dive. Why? Because this was the first time we were dealing with a problem that was created by banks or by poor debt, so to say. Now, this is the same exact problem that is happening right now in China. So, there is a roadmap that already exists. So, I think that the Chinese government will be able to handle it. Why am I confident? Because I believe not in the Chinese government, but in the theory that if a roadmap has been prepared and presented and that has helped the world navigate the 2008 financial crisis, the same roadmap will be used by another player, which is China right now. Just to back it up, you might have noticed that when the coronavirus pandemic hit, it was a very uncertain situation. The first wave of coronavirus brought a lot of destruction in terms of the financial repercussions on the world. The economy all across the globe tanked massively, right? The correction happened in the first wave of coronavirus. When the second wave of coronavirus hit India, how much did the stock market correct? It did not correct much. Why? Because stock markets hate uncertainty. When wave 1 came, it was a completely uncertain situation. No one knew what would happen, what the extent of coronavirus would be. When the first wave completely wiped out and it went away, then people understood that, okay, you know what, okay, coronavirus, really bad stuff, but we will be able to get past it, right? So therefore, wave 2 did not create that massive an impact. In 2008, it was the first time that the stock markets fell so much because of the makings of financial sector or the poor operations of the financial sector. We are witnessing the same situation in China right now. Now, of course, it's a very complex country, lot of differences, etc., etc. But somewhat of this uncertainty can be handled. And that is what I'm betting on. I'm not showing trust in China, but what I'm betting on is that this is not as uncertain as it looks. There has been a roadmap that has already been given by the US on how to navigate this. So I'm assuming that the Chinese government will also be able to execute it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Press the like button and I will see you the next time.